3 days ago, something happened that will change the way that I look at my brother for the rest of my life. I've known my brother Matt since he was born. I've known him in various roles as a fellow explorer of the woods behind my parents' house, a fellow combatant on the basketball court in my parents' driveway. I've known him as a roommate, as a classmate, as a teammate. I've known him as a brother and as a friend. But 3 days ago, after 3 sleepless nights, on the part of he and his wife, Matt came into the waiting room at the hospital to let me and my family know that he was now a father. Olivia Grace Hollowell is an 8-pound, 8-ounce bundle of life. We're a little bit worried. We think that she might be part lizard. She likes to stick her tongue out about every 2 seconds and lick her lips. But People magazine has just named her the cutest baby in the history of the universe, which is a small consolation for being part lizard. She is the cutest thing that we have ever seen, and we all stood in awe as we looked upon her and took turns holding her and passing her around the room. I also, though, in that moment noticed my brother, the one who I'd known in so many roles, and I saw him take on a new role, the role of father. And this one seemed to be particularly different from all of the other roles that I had known him in. The Jews knew God in many roles and in many ways. God was the judge in the Old Testament. He was the person who smited cities by calling down hail and fire and brimstone, such as we see will eventually happen to the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah in our first reading. God in the Old Testament was the lawgiver. He was the person who hardened Pharaoh's heart. And he killed a guy for accidentally bumping into the Ark of the Covenant. He wiped out entire nations and races and cities of people. God is the person, the God who shows up. Anytime he shows up in the presence of the Jewish people, he is accompanied by earthquakes and lightning and fire and smoke. Which would explain why the apostles ask Jesus, after watching Jesus go off to pray, "Lord, how do you do that? How do you pray? Teach us how to pray. How do you approach God who has, up to this point in our experience of our entire nation and all of our people and all of our ancestors, the only approach to Him has been fear and trembling. How do you go off and pray to Him?" And Jesus says, He gives them the key for how to approach God. He says to them, He is your Father. You are to approach Him now as Father. And you can imagine that the apostles got caught on that word instantly. Jesus, of course, went on to tell them the rest of the Our Father prayer. But you know that the apostles were just baffled by the fact that Jesus says, call Him Father. Father. This is a new role, one that is completely different and is a very drastic change from the other roles that God has played in the history of the Jewish people. So drastic, in fact, is this change from the God of the Old Testament to now the fact that the apostles are being told that they are to call Him Father. So drastic is that change that in the early church, one of the first heresies was a teaching that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament were two different deities, two different gods. And we can see how that would take root and how that heresy might spread, because sometimes when you look at it on a very surface level, it seems that they may in fact be two different gods. Jesus, in telling us to call God Father, does not say that the God of the Old Testament is gone or that He was a bad God. In fact, Jesus says not one word, not one letter of the old law will be wiped away. That God is still there, and He is still the God who loves us as Father, the God of the Old Testament. They are one God. But Jesus gives us an avenue or a way to approach Him that it was unforeseen at that point in history. Approach Him and live with Him as Father. St. Paul confirms this understanding because he says over and over again in the New Testament that we are adopted sons of God. We are adopted children of God. Now, we as human beings have two hurdles, I think, to get over in order to really approach God as Father. First of all, we have the idea or the aspect that we are adopted. Anytime you talk to people in a family where some of the children have been adopted and some have been born to the parents, you know that you get the sense that the adopted children struggle with that. Am I really loved as much as the natural children? Am I really loved as much as the natural children? We also have the complex in this aspect, in this relationship with God as Father. We have the complex of the eldest child. Now, many of us are familiar with the fact that the oldest child often gets extra praise. And a lot of times parents might be tempted to say to their younger children, why can't you be more like your oldest brother or your oldest sister? And certainly these two aspects are sort of magnified as problems for us, given the fact that our oldest child, our oldest brother, is Jesus. We think God cannot love me as much as He loves His natural-born Son because I am adopted. And we think, even if we do think that, we still think, well, Jesus is such a hurdle, such a giant figure in our family's life. How can God still look at me as being equal with Christ? How can He look at me as just another child when Jesus is in the picture? What we need to realize, though, is that God looks on us as our Father, yes, and He also looks on us, though, in the same way that He looks at Christ. When He looks at us, God does not see an adopted child. He does not see the younger child of Jesus. He sees us as one of His children. That's how He looks on us. And He asks us to look on Him as a Father. In the Mass, every Mass, before we say the Our Father, the priest says the following. Jesus taught us to call God our Father, and so we have the courage to say. Indeed, Jesus did teach us to call Him Father, and He taught us in today's Gospel when He says He teaches us how to pray and how to approach Him. But the other part of that phrase is also important. So we have the courage to say. It takes courage to approach the God that we read about in the Old Testament as Father, trusting that He loves us as a father loves his own son or daughter. It takes courage. And it also takes humility. It takes humility for us sometimes in our adulthood, in our pride and in our stubbornness. It takes humility to realize that we are children in the eyes of God.